So a little bit of a panel discussion. A little bit about me. I think I've someone's really done that introduction, so I won't really labour too much on myself. Richard Choi. Richard's CEO of NatSpec and has a lot of experience in standards and getting those applied across the industry. Christopher Delore, electrical engineer, expert in delivering building information modelling. EngWorks provides BIM solutions to businesses right across the world in various regions and various countries and languages. Marcus Fitch, BIM guru, I guess, to Grundfos, and been a driver in getting Grundfos's BIM libraries into the marketplace over the last few years. And Jeff Layton, who's a BIM manager and currently with Victaulic, and been instrumental in getting Victaulic's BIM libraries out there in the world. So I think you've looked at enough models coming out of CAD and Revit and so on, but I thought I'd show you this one, which is Lego. And interesting to contemplate the parallels. This is also Lego. Pretty amazing what people can build out of Lego, and anybody who's got or had children or grandchildren, boys, and sat there at a table and built a little Lego kit for their 8th birthday or whatever, might appreciate the challenge of building something like that out of Lego. Or something like this. But the reason that works, and if you take even an icon like this one, which I think we've all seen from the 30s, and you can build that out of Lego, but the reason it works is that Lego has a defined standard. And because they've got the defined standard, you can rely on that. You can take that standard. People, all sorts of manufacturers, can make things to that standard, and from that you can build something like this. And that's exactly what we're dealing with standard content. You're not going to be anywhere in terms of building a model in any sort of reasonable time frame unless you're using manufacturers' content or somebody's content. No one's really going to go and reinvent everything to go into a model each time. So that really gets us to today's discussion. Please feel free to interject and ask questions if you want to, but I'll fire off a few, and I'll perhaps address the first two to Jeff and Marcus. What do you think is the driving motivation behind your BIM initiatives to provide content to manufacturers? Is it a business driver developer? Is it the users coming to you? Perhaps I'll throw that over to you.
You know, if I should start, it's really a bit of a mix, to be honest. I think for any manufacturer, it's really about looking at what is the cost involved in delivering models, what value does it create? Now I know Chris says don't say value, but really for us, the value in the models that we provide, and which is so absolutely cool about BIM Bible, is standards, which I think is a nice intro, and I like the link to Lego. Grundfos just got a new CEO. He's from Lego, so maybe something will, come out of that. But basically, the math you could say that we do is, well, the value for us in a standard is that we don't have to make so much. The value to you, for designers, for builders, is that you can use our models or any standard model and not have to spend the time doing that, and then whether or not you want to pass on that savings down the line. As we heard Victor said yesterday, that doesn't always happen, but I mean, we are creating value in the supply chain for that. Where does it come from? In some countries, there's a lot of talk and requests for BIM, not necessarily that much into what should that model include. I guess the major point here is how do you do manufactured content? You tell us what you need, we'll ship it to you, I guess.
Jeff?
Hello. good. So Victaulic saw in 1997 a need to get in control of our product in the engineering world and in contractor world. We found back then that we were seeing software vendors creating softwares that had our products in them, but they weren't keeping the product accurate. Sorry, I used the word accurate. So they weren't updating them. We have, you can imagine Victaulic putting out new products, almost weekly, maybe monthly. So it was really hard to keep our products the way they should be in a constructible CAD file or model. And back then we created 2D blocks and then 3D blocks, and then we started creating content and supporting over 30 different softwares in the world. So, and the driving force behind that is obviously we want to get our product in a design, in a spec, and obviously sell our product. So we just thought that offering this free service would pay back in the future, and it has. And now we're continuing that process with Revit Content recently.
And perhaps a question to Richard and Christopher, who are probably the users on the other end of the scale. Richard perhaps is a middleman.
We get the feedback from every end. I mean, it's very nice for the manufacturers to have models, and as you already pointed out, they're finding that the architects and engineers are getting models that aren't compatible with what they're doing or is out of date. So, I mean, that's the hardest one. We've gone back to the manufacturers and said, well, okay, if we get involved in helping you create models, how are you going to keep it up to date? And they go, oh, you can do it for us, which sounds really, really nice. But we work with manufacturers already on their specification information, including Victaulic, who's a product partner, and we know how hard it is to get the information. And a designer wants it right when they're making the model. They don't want it right, oh, we'll give you the model in 6 months' time or 12 months' time. So the industry is coming back and saying, currently, internationally, there are no standard property sets for models. That's the big one. And we believe we have to have global property sets, not local property sets, because manufacturers don't want, how many countries are there? So we're seeing a great demand for it, but without the standards, an impossible way to deliver it for manufacturers.
And Chris, you're a user effectively in some ways.
A user and a builder.
Yeah, a user and a builder, and
Yes.
across multiple countries, multiple languages. How do you perceive this as the utiliser, if you like, of what the manufacturers are producing?
Well, I mean, we started in 2007, so it's been a long journey. I think that content building definitely was frustrating because a market always starts out with the manufacturer. You go and want to build the content, and the first thing they're going to ask is how many users are there, right? I mean, what's going to be the value if I build that content? So in the beginning of a market, there is no answer for that. And so then when the market comes along, then the amount of builders that come to the door of the manufacturer becomes large. And then there's a new distribution tool every day, and all of a sudden there's 10 people at the door, 9 of them with the wrong story. And then they go low cost, and all of a sudden you all know how it is. You're going to, find 1 out of 10 content, 10 out of 10, it's a crapshoot. So what we did after all of that, and these guys here can confer with that, we tried to change the game as the message to the manufacturer, because just saying, oh, you can get specified was not getting signatures on contracts. And obviously they had 10 people at the door, and they all built the best BIM content ever. So what we saw was the issues that manufacturers have had for 20 years. We saw different data sources. They have different user audiences. So again, you have to produce for a contractor, design, and owner. So, and they have multiple platforms. They already had CAD configurators popping out 15 to 20 platforms. So Revit was then looked at just another platform, but the issue is you couldn't convert to BIM. So kind of threw a problem in there for them. So today, actually, when we go in, we don't talk so much about platform and content. We talk about data. Because of the multiple BIM platforms coming along, and again, data, we're talking about that the last few days. The real issue with them is trying to have a unified database, because if you're going to go to 5 different distribution arms, what's going to be that center of truth for them? And so we really get into configuration and unifying data so that the manufacturer can then syndicate and then go to different platforms. Or like Tyler said, there'll be different tools, and you can send it out that way. But definitely standards, there are no standards, so that is an issue. But I think at the end of the day, from a manufacturer's point, a lot of them, they build the content to suffice for the user, but really deep down, a lot of manufacturers need more than that, and it comes from lead generation and the results of building that content. So for them, they want to see building content equals sales from those downloads. And so it's a complicated game for them. It's not as easy as saying engineers and architects want content and I'll build it, right? It's much more complicated.
Do you see any difference in the demands between, say, the designers who really want something soft and parametric because their requirements are changing on or being changed on them, versus the contractors who really want something pretty well locked in? They don't want it to change. They want the opposite. We picked it, and it's just going to stay like that because that's how it's going to go up. So does that create pressures for you in terms of your content and keeping that up to date, or what they want from it?
Yeah, actually, it does create a lot more work, because we obviously have to have 2 different content packages. One for a contractor who demands things like bolt sets and gaskets and weld gaps and all the things that are important to fabrication, but for the engineers who just want to design intent, we also have to have a package for that as well. So yes, it increases the demand and also the amount of hours we spend in it.
Do you find the same thing, Marcus? Or?
Yeah, I guess that the whole point, or the whole thing about updating, yeah, it's tedious. Yesterday we heard Warwick said, well, okay, we've now broken a pump down to those 120 parameters. Well, that is taken out of a data set of about 20,000 for a generic centrifugal pump. Yeah, there's difference in what the different users want, but if we look through the whole value chain and we say, okay, if we start defining some standards, that means that we begin getting compatibility. And as Dennis said earlier about, okay, you put in an incremental effort, you get exponential control, because once you begin having that compatible system of all components being with the information that you would like to be there, well, then you can begin optimizing the systems, optimizing the buildings. What does that lead to? It leads to lower life cycle cost. It leads to lower cost in general for the building, because you will be designing and building and constructing things smarter. So that's why there you have the value throughout the value chain. And Chris is probably going to shoot me for saying value so much, but I mean, that's the long shot that we want to take and why we want to invest in this.
Yeah, I think, in the standards, I think it's as important saying that standards means that manufacturers will build more. I don't see that as the most important part. I think as developers, the whole issue is that if you do not have an isolated schema throughout, the cool products that we can produce can't be done. I mean, we have a product for version 6. We still can't have an easy button because content that we're going to digest from all builders has no continuity. And so I think that as much as having the foundation model definitely helps, where there's not much thinking. Obviously, builders might be able to build more, but I still think that the thing that kills us with the standards is what tools we can produce if we knew there was a schema that matched up internationally.
So there's an initiative here in Australia to get some standards defined. Everybody recognises the problem. Are you seeing that anywhere else, same sort of initiatives? Are there similar sort of drives in other countries to try and solve this problem? Or do you think it'll be one day it'll just emerge, or do we simply adopt a standard from a country and just go with it and see what happens after that? How do we...
I think, this is probably easier said than done, but, we have standards for everything. We have standards for standards, and we have, great events like this. We have yet to have an event that concentrates strictly on content and communication that really drives decisions on the criteria for creating content on a global basis. BIM at BOSS is a great start. Somebody commented earlier today, I believe, about they don't see much of this going on in the U.S. and the standards and all the conversations we had with Warwick. It seems like in Australia that there's a lot of passion for each other's business and the industry as a whole to get better. So what better place to try to drive and start some kind of event that's going to drive the ability to create some standards and how to do that. I was talking to our CAD manager, the guy who's really in charge of the content, and his take on this is at Victaulic we have the resources to create anything you want. We just don't know what it is that everybody wants and what the data is. We can create it like the way we think the data should be, but we're working in the U.S. and Canada and Europe and Australia. I was in Mexico last week, so things are different all over the world, and we just need some guidelines to get to the 90% mark, and then leave the 10% for the specific markets to add or delete or change standards.
Sounds like a good idea for another event. It's probably getting to the point. I think we've been doing this initiative kicked off about 5 years ago, but perhaps it is a case of sit down and someone just make a decision and let's run with it.
You still got to recognise how far we've actually moved in that amount of time. I mean, I remember when we started the steering committees and hard decisions had to be made straight away. And you were there, and remember, it was, we're not going to sit around the table for too long. Let's make decisions. Decision was to go with software that was available, was readily used, because we knew it would take another 3 years to, do any other decision. The AMCA and BIM MEPOS has, I think everyone recognises it as a world leader in where it's moved. How the standards develop over the next 12 months, I think once again creates the template for everything else. And part of our role, we work with an international group, and we share the knowledge of what's happening in Australia with all of those countries, and our hope is that they'll actually duplicate what's happening here, there. Now, we don't care if they call it their version of it, but it's about trying to have the same standard everywhere to stop that duplication and to learn from each other.
Christopher, you've, perhaps I'll ask a question of you. Do you see the same concern from other manufacturers of content? Are they struggling with the same problem in terms of no one's got a standard and so on?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you have two companies here that, are best in breed. And when you get into the early days, those were the guys that were building because they have more of a responsibility to their end user. Like I said, I think a lot of times, frankly, when we go in, they're going to trust the builder, whether that's good or bad, depends who the builder is. But I think, again, what's important is that And what we find in configuration is that when you're cleaning your data, that standard will help because, again, you have to take that data and siphon it out. So if there is a standard or schema that is the same, it does help the manufacturer generate more content without guessing. Obviously, then there's going to be less issues from the user base. So, yeah, I mean, like I said, they struggle with a lot of things, you know. Standard's just one of them.
I mean, a couple challenges are, you know, when a software between releases changes how it handles content, you know, from year to year. Now we got to go back and validate the whole package again. There are a tremendous amount of things that maybe you do think about these things, but from a manufacturer standpoint, in order to put out a great product, not only physically out in the site, but in your model, it takes a lot of work and a lot of QC and also a lot of, you know, I mean, when we're creating processes and things to try to automate something, and then next year it changes, it really throws a kink in the work. So setting a standard, or at least to 90%, if we can create those tools that automates things, it would really help a manufacturer to be efficient.
Yeah, but I also want to say that from an international perspective, I mean, what those awake in this auditorium is actually doing is basically creating history, because yeah, can be issues with software handling things differently. I mean, that's just a challenge for us as content producers to handle that. But you know, setting or having an idea, being able to communicate what you want to do with this data and how you want to use it throughout the supply chain gives inspiration to others. As it was said earlier, the thing that we primarily hear when people say, well, we need to do this stuff in BIM, like in the UK, and you ask, okay, well, what do you want to do with it? And it's like, well, we don't know. It's just a paragraph in a government mandate. So what their thought is what Warwick yesterday referred to as you know, 3D CAD on steroids. And so I mean, I really want to take the opportunity to congratulate on at least being conscious about what you're trying to achieve, because it is inspiring people in the US, in the UK, and Singapore, all over the world. And of course, there are design firms and contractors that do have an idea about what they want to do and are very concrete in their needs, and we can work with them, and we do work with them. But doing it in a broader forum helps the industry in its entirety.
I might throw it out to some questions. Any questions from the floor? If anybody want to pose to these learned gentlemen? That's it. Yep.
Is any of the panel aware of the BIM store? Oh, sorry. Can you hear me? Is anyone in the panel aware of the BIM store, BIM Bible content creation manual that's available? 44-page document which outlines basically content creation, runs through a whole lot of standardization, parameter adding, all sorts of kind of content-related issues. Yeah, I thought...
Is the author from CTC in the United States?
It's from the UK.
Oh, UK.
The BIM store. I think predominantly they're a content creator themselves, but they offer this thing called the Bible, and it's quite a useful document. It's a good starting.
It's called the BIM Bible?
It's called the BIM Store Bible.
I think when I was searching the net, I ran out of about 40. I just gave up looking of different websites that offer BIM content. And I think one of the problems that we wrestle with is the continuity and quality of that content can be enormously variable. I think some of the large manufacturers will have the resources to put into those libraries to get them to be fairly high quality. When you get to the smaller manufacturers, and being electrical, I look at lighting suppliers who, particularly when it gets to LEDs, the technology is changing almost weekly on them. So the challenges they have keeping libraries together is enormous, and the smaller manufacturers simply haven't got the resources to put into producing high quality content, let alone having a standard to work to, and picking any one of dozens of libraries to try and lodge that data into.
And many of the large ones, do not create their own. In the 7 years, there's very few that we know. So many have tried, and many have failed. But it's a rough job. Building content is rough. It is not glorious. In our business, it's the most difficult sector because, you can read the BIM Content Bible but the issue is really siphoning down what needs to be in that content. Obviously, as engineers, and what we concentrate on, connectors are so important. Intuitive usage is very important. A lot of things, I think people put things black and white about content, and that's right. You can build a piece of content 4 or 5 ways and separate lookup tables and type catalogs all different ways, but what makes sense to the user? And that's why you can have the Wild West of builders, and that's why there aren't a lot of great builders in the world, because I think you obviously have to have some passion from the engineering side. Building MEP pieces, it's not something you just throw down to someone and try to guess what inlet and outlet's going to be. But again, it's not an easy. It's definitely not an easy business.
There's other things like language barriers all over the world. So everything we do in the U.S., we have to translate to other languages. There's metric, imperial. That's pretty easy, but
that's your fault.
There's also
that was Chris. Just
nice. There's also the supply chain aspect where we have part codes. We have millions and millions of part codes, and none of them make sense to me just by looking at them. But and distribution has part codes, and the contractors have part codes, and so there's a whole new level of things going on with the content that we are creating some add-ons that are going to be available on our website, and also to the BIM at Boss as well. That will allow you to extract bill of materials. It's called the procurement tool. It will have some functionality on part codes and translating at some point, our part code to the distribution to the contractor or whatever's needed. So there are, I could probably sit here and rattle off, 1,000 different challenges that we have, and they're just opportunities. They're not anything that's a pain or anything. It actually gives a lot of people work at Victaulic. So anyway, just pointing out, and also Warwick, your update on the fire protection product with the red color. It is done, and we have to just update it on the BIM at Boss. Okay.
All is good.
Carl, can I ask a question, mate? It's Chris
sure.
up here again. Sorry, I'm not going to get mad at anybody. Is Steve Butler still in the room? Yeah, oh, good. All right, I'll ask it nice and open. Steve, I'm just wondering, from the Autodesk side, let me preface this first by saying I'm one of the co-authors of ANZRS, so I have a particular view on certain things, and admittedly it's a little bit different to some in the room because the focus of what was produced was geared mostly around what the design consultants needed, less so for manufacturing and for the contractors. So that's a limitation I'll put out there to start with. We also had the least amount of contribution when it was being developed from the MEP discipline-based engineers, so it's weakest in that regard. And there's some alignment between ANSYS and BIM App Oz, which is an ongoing conversation. But thinking about a conversation I had just yesterday with Jeff about the fact that you can, for example, create parts in Revit as subcomponents, if you like, so you start nesting things. That's something we were, at ANSYS, we tried to steer people away from because of the performance degradation that caused. Now, I know that Autodesk create Inventor, which is akin to SolidWorks. It's a fantastic tool, the way it's built for handling smaller units and hierarchical or tiered units. Is there anything that Autodesk can do to help this issue? Because from a design consultant's perspective, we do want performance, we want fluidity, we want flexibility to be able to change our minds and explore the what-if scenarios. Once you get to construction stage, usually those decisions are fixed, so the performance implications of things like nesting is less of an issue. But if Revit had within it at the back end, or maybe through some extra level of interoperability that exists or doesn't exist yet between Revit and Inventor, can the factory do anything to help this? Because we could, in fact, I think, then achieve something closer to a single standard that would at least alleviate the two libraries down to one issue.
Well, you going to answer, Steve?
Well, there seem to be several questions there, really.
Yeah.
And I think some of it is back to you, really, as the users. You know, what do you want to see? What do you expect? We do have interoperability with Revit, with Inventor and Revit. I'm not going to comment on how good or bad that is.
Well, I can talk about that if you
it's
want.
available. What, good or bad, Chris? Or just whether it's available?
I mean,
Chris talks about that.
3 years ago, we had the Inventor team in. I mean, obviously, they had a product called AEC Exchange, and this was something to press the magic button and get into Revit. Did not work that well, and we showed the team it didn't work that well. And we work with it every release, and it gets better. The issues with it, I think, is that if you think what you're trying to do by taking an engineering model and press a magic button and, you know, take certain fidelity out of it, connectors to be perfectly set, you're talking about a lot of stuff going on. And frankly, in the MEP space, think how many different types of equipment we have. Think how many types of variations. So think from Autodesk producing this, it would have to guess, hey, I need to take out these bolts because Revit, you don't need those. And so the thing we do use the BIM Exchange for is we use it on ETO, or engineering, you know, to order products. Because, for instance, we'll get a thing and there's a huge assembly. And assemblies are not worth trying to create for a manufacturer because they're all one-offs, right? So there we take, we'll take Inventor files, and we have a process we go through that we can do it fairly quickly, edit the connectors, and they can send it out. It's the reason why, like a Train and Carrier or these big companies, you don't see much from them. They have a huge problem. They have highly configurable objects, and a lot of it's ETO. So I think they keep. I think it's the 3rd or 4th version. We look at it every time. You know, I don't know if it's going to be the magic bullet on there. I mean, I think they work hard to keep on improving it, but it's still pretty cumbersome.
It's not intended to be a magic bullet, silver bullet. You know, when you think about it, you've got the AEC industry, MEP specifically here, and you've got the manufacturing industry. They're trying to solve two completely different problems with their content. And so that tool exists to really, originally, it was to take anything that the manufacturer had produced. There was this belief that, oh, if you're making it, if you're creating this piece of content, surely we can just reuse it. I'm not sure that's the right approach. We've never seen people really dive down that. There's not that many people using, say, Inventor and Revit. You know, they're using something else. It presents all manner of other challenges. I think it's a good tool. You know, I'm not going to say otherwise. But I think they're trying to solve different problems. And I think really what we need to be talking about is how do we solve this problem for AEC. And you're right, standards are a way forward. There are a few standards around the world, but I think, you know, BIM Metals is doing the right thing. There's also one in Germany called VDI 3805, which is an interesting one. And then, of course, there's always the argument around IFC4. Is that the silver bullet? So there's a lot of other, you know, there's a lot of things out there.
Where we have that challenge is on our NXT valves for our fire protection line. You could have 30 different products combined to make one, but fortunately you only need 1 or 2 in a project. So it hasn't been a problem yet, but That's just an example. You know, if we needed 10 of them, it would be a problem.
And I think for the data on the going back to data, the issue with Inventor and Revit and CAD-Map or any platform, if in their configurators where the data is and it's clean, then you don't worry about things like that, because then you truly can create the platforms natively, which they have to be, and give change management to the manufacturers and force that data down, right? Because anytime you're going to try to convert, you have huge problems. So again, if you get back to data and configuration, that's where I think, you know, not only can you leverage data from syndication and going forward to different products, but the thing is you can eliminate worrying about translation, because obviously that was done early on with SAT files and all the early day blobs that you couldn't use. That's what was happening there. So, you know, I think.
I just want to add, I guess, one final thing for me before. I mean, I need a drink and you need a drink. The approach that we've taken is, okay, we said the only way that we can actually solve this is by having a proper configurator. So now we build a configurator for all our product families, which means when you go in, and those of you that might work with pumps, when you go in and you size a pump, you know, it generates the CAD, the Revit files on the go. That also means that, at least in theory, because we haven't really thought about that, but you could take that as designed model, because you could potentially have everything about operating modes and loads and life cycle costs and everything in that model. And to compare that with as is and use it in facility management later on. And I think that is where we actually, in the future, begin to provide, you know, cost savings, value adding, and all other kinds of buzzwords. But for me, configuration is the only way to handle a mass portfolio.
Well, sounds like we've got a new initiative and a good subject for perhaps a smaller, more compact forum, but one directed to defining some standards from it. I think on that note, we're beyond drinks time. Sumit's going to give us 5 minutes of his time to wrap up. And I'd like you to say thanks to the panellists for their wisdom.